In this program, I'm going to answer a simple question. What do you use to fill raised beds? I know lots of you have built these beds and now you have the problem of filling them, and soil's expensive. So you get online and look at other options, and everybody's got an idea of how you should fill it. What kind of soil to use? What kind of amendments to use? What do you put at the bottom of a raised bed? All those questions. And we're going to answer all of those in this program. Now, you might have noticed that I'm wearing something special here. I just received this, and it's the Silver Award for the Best Science Book of 2023, and it's awarded by the Independent Publishers Group. It's great to win the award, but it's a little heavy for wearing around the house. Anyways, I received the award for my book, Plant Science for Gardeners. And I think this is a book that everybody should read. It gives you the basics of plant growth. Once you understand some basic concepts of plant growth, you'll be able to make the right decisions in the garden. You'll be able to read things on the internet, and right away you'll know whether they make sense or not. A lot of my myth busting is done that way. I understand plant growth very well, so I can quickly spot the garbage that's out there. If you're interested in that book, it is available on Amazon, Plant Science for Gardeners. Now let's get back to the program. Height really matters with raised beds. You need enough soil to actually grow the roots of the plant. Any bed that is less than a foot tall should be filled entirely with soil. Now, when we're talking about filling a bed, there are sort of three different levels that you can consider. One is the stuff that goes right in the bottom, or even underneath the bed. Then there's that middle layer. A lot of people use bulky material there so they can cut down on the amount of soil. And then there's the top layer, the real soil where the plants will be growing. And I'm going to divide this program into those three different sections. So let's first talk about what goes into the bottom of the raised bed. A lot of people put weed barrier down there. And why do they do that? Well, they're trying to stop the weeds from growing up into the bed. Now that doesn't make any sense. Most weeds won't grow that far in soil. The soil will smother them, like your lawn grass. 3-4 inches of soil will kill that grass. The same goes for most of the weeds that you might have in your lawn. Now there are some very noxious weeds like bindweed and Canada thistle. They can grow up through soil 6 feet with no problem. Well, I have news for you. Putting weed barrier at the bottom of your raised bed is not going to stop those plants. They'll crawl up between the bed and the weed barrier. No matter how hard you staple that on there, they're still going to find their way up. Putting weed barrier in the bottom of bed also affects the way the water flows through the bed. It's going to tend to trap it down there. You're making a bog in the bottom of your raised bed. That's not good for plant roots. There is no good reason to put weed barrier in the bottom of a raised bed. It's not going to stop the weeds, and it causes water issues. Most of the weeds you'll get in a raised bed come from above. The wind blows the seeds in from around the raised bed. That's where the weeds come from. Put something at the bottom does you no good whatsoever. A lot of people like putting cardboard and newspaper in the bottom. Again, in part to keep those weeds from growing and to kill the grass. But as I've already said, a couple inches of soil will do that. So that's not necessary. A lot of people are going around talking about lasagna gardening, which is more correctly called sheet mulching. Lasagna gardening does not improve soil very much. That cardboard has no nutrient. It does have some carbon, and that helps a little bit. But putting paper in the bottom of your bed doesn't really improve anything. Now, if you have some, go ahead and put it down there and get rid of it. But don't make a big deal about putting paper down there. It's not going to help your raised bed. How about wire mesh, which is also called hardware cloth? Now, this may make some sense. Putting this at the bottom of a bed prevents rodents digging up through it, things like mice, rats, and chipmunks. But it only works if the holes in that hardware cloth are small enough. It has to be at least 1/4 inch or smaller. Now, does this keep rodents out of your garden? Maybe, but probably not. Mice and rats have no problems crawling up things, so they can crawl up the outside of your raised bed and get at your food. Now, where it does make sense to put something at the bottom is if you're trying to keep groundhogs out. They don't climb so much. They're mostly trying to dig underneath, so that will work. It also makes sense if you're planning to cover the bed with mesh, keep things out there. So you have a top covering and a bottom covering, and now you can make that pretty rodent proof. And that makes sense. How about drainage? People are very concerned about the drainage of this soil. So they like to put stones in the bottom for added drainage. Well, that simply doesn't work. When you have two layers of different kinds of material, so soil up here and stones down here, water comes through the soil and stops. It doesn't go into the gravel. I know that's not very intuitive, but that's how it works. Gravel at the bottom does not increase drainage. The same goes for houseplants. That's why you never put gravel or anything in the bottom of pots of your houseplants. It simply doesn't work for increasing drainage. Don't put it at the bottom of a raised bed. It doesn't work there either. So there you have it. Those are the things you might put right in the bottom of a bed. Now let's move up to the middle layer. The problem here is that people build beds and then they go out and they price the soil, and it's going to be really expensive to fill these beds, not to mention all the work of hauling soil around. So they get online, they look for better options, cheaper options, and they find some. And so we start throwing all kinds of stuff into the bed so we don't have to buy soil. Well, let's look at a couple of these options. A very popular option are logs or branches, any kind of leftover wood. So that's put in the bottom. It does take up space, so you need less soil. Most of this wood starts decomposing and absorbs moisture, so it kind of acts like a watering system for your plants. But there's a fundamental problem with this. Wood has a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio. What that means is that when microbes try to decompose it, they need to find nitrogen somewhere else. And that somewhere else is in the soil around the wood. The microbes pull nitrogen out of the soil to help decompose the wood. But nitrogen is critical for plant growth. So if plant roots grow down to where the wood is, they're not going to find enough nitrogen. The microbes are much more efficient at pulling that nitrogen away. Now you can compensate this by fertilizing more and adding more nitrogen to your raised beds. You really don't have any idea of how much you should add. Over time, this wood does decompose. Now, big logs would take longer to completely decompose, and smaller ones are faster. But eventually, all this wood decomposes. As it decomposes, the level of your soil falls down. So let's say it takes 10 years for the wood to completely decompose. Over that 10-year period, you're constantly having to add more soil to keep the level up. After 10 years, you filled the bed with soil. So what was the purpose of adding this wood? I mean, it seems to me as if this is a short-term fix. So you don't have to buy so much soil today, but eventually you're going to have to buy that soil. So why don't you just bite the bullet and buy the soil now, get the job finished. Then 10 years from now, you don't have to redo it. Another common suggestion I see is putting dry leaves in the bottom. Now in fall, you've got lots of these leaves, and you can fill up the whole bed with leaves if you like. But this has the same problem as wood. Leaves have very high carbon to nitrogen ratios, and the microbes that decompose the leaves will steal nitrogen from the soil and from your plant root. Eventually, those leaves decompose and your soil level shrinks. Now, the leaves do add some organic matter to the soil and will improve it a little bit, but this isn't the best way to improve your soil. It's better to have that organic matter mixed throughout the soil layer. So if you have excess leaves, sure, throw them in the bottom. But I don't think it's a really good solution. What about kitchen scraps or yard waste? Kitchen scraps have a fairly high amount of nitrogen, so they won't pull nitrogen away from your plant. So those are a good thing to add. But who has enough kitchen scraps to make much of a difference in a deep bed? The yard waste has more carbon in it. So again, it has the same problem as dry leaves. But if you have it, you want to get rid of it, it's better down there than giving it to the city in a green bin. But it doesn't really add much value to the raised bed. You're better off composting that material and composting the leaves and bringing that back and mulching your raised bed with compost. How about rocks? Now we talked about small rocks in the bottom for drainage, and that doesn't work. But what about big rocks? Well, they actually work. If I fill the bed with both rocks and soil, so that soil surrounds the rocks take up space. You need less soil. The rocks are very stable, so they're going to be there for a million years. So rocks in there do work, provided you keep them away from the top foot or so of the soil, because you don't want to bang them when you're digging plants. But if they're in the lower section and you have soil between them, they will reduce the amount of soil you need. And if you happen to have the rocks laying around anyways, there's no cost involved. And some people go out to places like building sites and scrounge rocks there. They're happy if you take the rocks away because they're going to have to clean them up anyways before they put a lawn down. All right, that takes care of the middle layer. Now we're talking about the top layer, the soil. That's where the plants are going to grow. Now, if you have very high beds, I would recommend that you have at least 2 feet of soil. If you want to put something in the bottom to take up space, all right, I understand you want to save some money. But at least 2 feet of that should be soil. Why? Because plants need the soil to grow in. That's where all the roots are going to be. Now, in nature, plant roots tend to grow horizontal and they go out from the plant. But in a raised bed, we're trying to plant very close together, and they can't go out past the edge of the raised bed. So you'll find more of the roots going down. And 2 feet is a good depth for plant roots. Now, there's a number of options for soil. The first one is real soil. And a really good option here is topsoil. So topsoil is the material that's removed before we do construction. We usually take the top 4 to 8 inches of soil away and preserve that, because that's where all the nutrients are. That's where all the organic matter is. That's really good soil. So we take it away, and then we do construction, like we build a new home. And then we bring a small amount of that back to put around the new house so we can plant grass. So we have these stockpiles of topsoil, and people who have that sell it to gardeners. And so that's a really good soil. Another option is a product called triple mix. Now, in theory, triple mix is 1/3 topsoil, 1/3 peat moss, and 1/3 compost. Now, I've looked at a lot of people who sell triple mix, and none of them guarantee that that's what goes into it. And I suspect the ratios vary quite a bit depending on the cost of material. But in general, triple mix is 1/3 soil and 2/3 organic matter. And it's great soil. It's fluffy. It's great for root growth. Grows great plants. It has one big downside. Remember that 2/3 organic matter? That's going to decompose over the next 2 or 3 years. And as it decomposes, it shrinks in size, and the level of your soil starts dropping in the raised bed. So each year, you got to add some more soil to bring it back up. Then the organic matter decomposes, the level goes down. Next year, you buy some more soil, you put it on top. That happens a lot less with topsoil. Now, it settles a bit too because they tend to fluff it up before they deliver it because they're selling it in volume. So it will settle that first year. But after the first year, it stays there. It doesn't keep getting smaller and smaller. But triple mix does grow great plants. Now, if you're buying either of those options, buy it in bulk. Don't buy it in bag. Get several yards delivered to you. Now, how do you know how much soil you need? Well, if you're not great at math, come over to gardenmyths.com and look up soil calculator. There's an automated calculator system. You just enter the size of your beds and it tells you how much bulk material you'll need or how many bags you need. And it works in both metric and imperial units. A really great system. You'll know exactly how much soil to buy. A very common amendment is perlite or vermiculite. Now, these materials are fairly similar to one another in the way they behave in soil. They add porosity. They make the soil fluffier, add more air in the soil, and let water drain better. They also hold water, so they improve the quality of the soil. Now, they don't add any nutrients. Both of these products are used in potting media that's used for houseplants, but I wouldn't use them outside. Both of these are man-made. They're non-organic, so they don't decompose over time. Once they're in your soil, you're stuck with them. There's no way to get them out if you decide you don't want them. Vermiculite in particular breaks down over time into smaller and smaller particles. Now, it doesn't decompose, but it does make these small particles which can cause problems in the soil. I would just keep those out of the garden. There's no purpose in adding those to raised beds. What about compost and manure? Well, these are excellent products, and I've talked about them in many videos. I love this stuff. It's organic, it decomposes over time, it releases nutrients for plants, it improves the structure of soil. It's just great stuff. So it's a good thing to add to soil and raised beds. There is one downside. Because gardeners understand that it's good, they use way too much. If you add too much organic material to soil, you can get to a point where you have high phosphate level. And high phosphate is toxic to plants. This problem has now been reported by a lot of people with raised beds. And the reason is that they've just added too much. When you're making a new raised bed and you're using soil and you want to add 20 to 30% compost manure, that's okay. And then in future years, you just put a couple inches on the top as a mulch, but don't use too much or you won't be able to grow anything in your bed. There's a myth floating around that you can't grow good food in regular soil, regular garden soil. I don't know where this started, but it doesn't make any sense. All the farmers are using regular soil. My whole life I've been growing vegetables in garden soil. Now, it's not always the best type of soil. You might need to amend it and improve it over time, but it all grows great vegetable. I think this is one of the reasons a lot of people have moved to raised beds, because they think that the soil in the ground can't be used, which is a real shame because that's the easiest way to grow vegetable. I also think it's one of the reasons that a lot of people with raised beds are looking for another alternative other than soil. So some people use a soilless mix. And one of the most popular is Mels Mex. This was developed by a gentleman by the name of Mel Bartholomew, and he's the fellow who made square foot gardening popular, wrote several books on it. His favorite mix is 1/3 vermiculite, 1/3 compost, and 1/3 peat moss. Notice that there's no soil in there. It's completely soilless. Now this makes a really nice soil. It's really fluffy and airy. Roots just love growing into it. So it is good for growing plants, but it has a number of downsides. I've already mentioned the problem with vermiculite. The other two components are peat moss and compost, and both of those are going to decompose over time. So after a number of years, you're only left with the vermiculite and a small amount of organic material. You have to keep topping these up over and over and over again every year because they settle so much. These soilless mixes also tend to dry faster, and once that peat moss is completely dry, it's hard to wet. Now the vermiculite will mitigate that to some extent. But the real problem with this mix is that it's really expensive compared to soil. Personally, I wouldn't use it in a raised bed. All right, what would I use? Well, I looked at all the combinations and all the recommendations, and I wanted to find the best soil for raised beds. And this is my criteria. I want it to be reasonably priced, hold moisture well, grow great plants, and have a material that doesn't shrink too fast. I don't want to have to replace it every year. Here's what I think is the best soil for raised beds. 75% topsoil and 25% compost. If the topsoil is really sandy, you might adjust that a little bit and do 70% soil and 30% compost. That will add more nutrients and water holding capacity to that sandy mix. But I think this is the best soil. Topsoil doesn't shrink very much. We've added some organic matter. That improves the nutrient level. The clay in that soil will hold water better than any of the soilless mixes. And I know for a fact that this grows great plants because I've used it myself. What about filling the bed? Well, I put nothing at the bottom except maybe hardware cloth if you're concerned about the rodents. But I think in most cases they're not that big of an issue, so you can skip that step. As far as the middle layer goes, don't put anything in there. Whatever you put in there is just a temporary solution. Bite the bullet and fill the whole thing with soil. At the very least, you want 2 feet of soil in your raised bed. If you've made really high beds and you can't afford the soil, I strongly recommend changing the bed so they're not so high. Now let's look at some mistakes people make. I've seen a suggestion that you should use 2 different kinds of soil. So they were using cheap garden soil in the bottom layer, and then on top of that, they used a different soil. like a triple mix soil or a soilless mix. That way the cost is lower. But that's a really dumb idea. Whenever you layer different kinds of soil on top of one another, there's the potential of creating a perched water table. That's a layer that doesn't allow water to move from one soil to the next. Don't do that. If you want to use those two types of soil, mix them all together before you fill the raised bed. Never have two layers of soil. The second mistake is raised beds that are too high. Now, I know some people have disabilities and they need the higher bed. But listening to people online, it becomes clear that many people are afraid to actually bend over and plant a few seeds. They want the comfort of a raised bed. Well, I have news for you. If you do gardening properly, you don't have to bend over very much. Sure, you have to bend over to plant the seeds in the spring. Most of the weeds are taken care of by the mulch you use. Taller plants like tomatoes and so on, they're harvested high up anyways. You don't have to bend over to harvest those. One summer I actually measured how much time I actually spend bent over in my garden. And it was very, very small. We're talking minutes to plant a row of crops and to harvest them. Go with a lower bed. In fact, I'd recommend using a raised bed that's no more than 8 inches tall. That will grow great food and solves all this problem of getting a lot of extra soil. Mistake number 3, people are afraid that their wood beds are going to rot. So they put plastic between the wood and the soil. And that seems to kind of make sense, right? You keep the wet soil away from the wood, and that will reduce the amount of rot you get in the wood, and your raised beds last longer. Unfortunately, that logic doesn't work. What the plastic actually does is that it traps moisture against the wood. It doesn't allow it to seep into the soil or go into the air. Plastic-lined raised beds actually rot faster than the ones without plastic. So don't put anything between the soil and the wood. Mistake number 4, creating a bathtub. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we built the bed. We've set it on our lawn. We've filled it with soil. Now, if we look at this, we actually have 2 layers of soil, don't we? We have the soil that's in the raised bed, and we have our native soil, which is below the raised bed. Those are 2 different kinds of soil. So we can create this perched water table right at the bottom of the raised bed. So water goes into the raised bed and gets trapped there, and the bottom layer stays extra wet. The solution to this is to put down your raised bed, mark the area, and then dig up that soil down about 6 inches or so. Then put some of your fill soil into that and mix it up really well. Then add another 6 inches of fill soil and mix that in the top layer. So what we're doing is we're creating a transition. We're going from native soil to partial native soil to even less native soil until we finally get into the fill soil. When we have this gradual change in soil, you won't create a water problem. Now let's have a look at some frequently asked questions. Do you need to kill the grass under the raised bed? And the answer is no. A couple inches of soil will do that for you. Now, if you're planning to dig up that soil under the bed, then it might be a good idea to get rid of the grass. But if you're not going to bother with that, just put the raised bed right on the grass and they'll be dead in no time. How full should you make this raised bed? Well, I would fill it right up to the top. And in fact, I would overfill it a little bit. And the reason for that is no matter what you're using, it's going to settle a little bit. Even topsoil settles. The act of bringing it to you, the act of shoveling it, putting it in a wheelbarrow, shoveling it into the raised bed, all of that adds air and fluffs it up. So it's all going to settle. So fill it as much as possible. In a couple of weeks, it will have settled and you can use it. The final level you're heading for is about 1 inch or 2 below the rim of the raised bed. That keeps the soil in, allows some room for mulch, and when you're watering, the water tends not to run over the top of the raised bed. Another common question is, how much soil do I need? And I've created a really nice soil calculator for you. Head on over to my website, gardenmist.com, and search for soil calculator. It's easy to use, calculates everything automatically, and it'll tell you exactly what you need to get, both in bulk material and bagged material. I hope you enjoyed this video, and now you've got your raised beds all full. It's time to grow some vegetables. If it's early in the season and you're thinking of starting things from seed, have a look at this video here. my 10 tricks for starting seeds. And if you want to learn more about growing vegetables, have a look at this video here. It covers my 10 favorite vegetables and how to grow them. Happy gardening.